back, everybody. Without any further ado, I'll turn it back over to Bill for our second panel.
Thanks, Adam. This panel is on, liberal democracy in practice, as opposed to in theory, which means what's happening actually in the political system right today. We have Ron Brownstein, a senior editor at The Atlantic and senior political analyst for CNN, author of long-time, extremely shrewd and thoughtful observer of American politics and beyond narrow politics, American society, and a longtime friend of mine. And I feel like since you're the senior editor and senior analyst, John should be like junior, you know. Right? John is a colleague of mine, obviously at the Weekly Standard, an excellent reporter who's covered a lot of races this year and in the past, and also given a lot of thought to what's going on politically. I said in the first panel that I thought after at least Mark Blitz's talk, we might avoid all talk of Trump, and we mostly avoided talk of Donald Trump, but I don't think that'll be possible on this panel. It would be a real challenge to pull off an hour discussion without the name, like one of these, anyway, not worth trying. Okay, let me frame it this. So we'll try to really just think through the moment as much as we can in an hour. And I'll begin this way. I was just at a meeting this morning, actually, intelligent group, and one person had just spoken with several political scientists, and therefore it was totally wrong. No, and then it had a guidance from them. And one of them had made this point. Say, oh, you people in Washington hysterical about Trump. He's changing everything, the party, this, that. Hard-headed, analytical view. Trump got basically the same vote Romney got in 2016 as he had gotten in 2012. Hillary Clinton was a slightly weaker candidate, maybe considerably weaker candidate than an incumbent, Barack Obama. So Trump loses by what, 2.5%, and Romney lost by 4+%. Trump threads the needle on the Electoral College. Huge party loyalty to Trump when has not been huge party loyalty to a president in his first term who's replaced a president of the previous party. Most of what he's doing is very recognizably Republican anyway. And furthermore, probably going to be a rough midterm election for the Republicans. But when has a party that's controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency not had a very rough mid-year election in its first off-year election? So it's all much ado about nothing. It's politics as usual with a particularly flamboyant or, controversial president. But ultimately, that's all noise, and the system is very much what it was 5 years ago or 25 years ago.
So
answer.
I think they are right on one point and really wrong on the bigger point. I think they are right in that this is not a unique departure. Trump did not create the centrifugal forces in our politics. But he extends them and intensifies and compounds them. And we are on a trajectory that I believe is truly destabilizing and tumultuous for the country. And, I often say, and I don't say it to be provocative or to make a point through hyperbole, I really do believe that we are living through the modern equivalent of the 1850s. I just don't know what the modern equivalent of the 1860s looks like. And I say that because I view, from David Potter and all of the great histories of the 1850s, I view the 1850s as essentially a Cold War between the North and South, where every issue and every institution ultimately was pulled apart along the sectional divide. And we are watching some kind of resorting of the country now that has, I think, parallels to that. Not exactly sectional, but both demographic and geographic. And just kind of think about, I think about this last election. I wrote a book 10 years ago called The Second Civil War. And at that point, I believe that everything that I wrote about then has intensified and progressed enormously since then. And where we are now is, I think, where all of the cherries on the slot machine in terms of economic structure, demographic structure, and cultural affinities all now align with partisanship, which was not true even when I wrote the book. Like, every cherry points in the same direction. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it geographically, virtually every dense metro in the country now, whether it is in a blue state or a red state, is Democratic. Hillary Clinton won 87 of the 100 largest counties in America. Okay, 87 out of the 100. She won them by over 15 million votes. Those 100 counties provided over half of all of her votes. Okay, so, and we're not only talking about Chicago, New York, and LA anymore. We're talking about Dallas and Atlanta and Houston, Salt Lake City, right? I mean, all of those places are becoming more Democratic. And I'll come back to the characteristics that they have. On the other hand, there are another 3,000 counties in America beside the 100 largest, and Donald Trump won 2,600 of those. You know, he won more counties than anybody in either party since Reagan in '84, when Reagan won 49 states. Bill Clinton won half the counties in America each time he won, right? So all the cherries weren't lining up at that point. There was not as clear a fissure between urban and rural America. But Clinton won the popular vote while winning fewer than 500 counties. Okay, just reflect on that for a minute.
Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton. Now, demographically, it's the same thing. I mean, the separation is getting bigger. Trump won a third of millennials. He won 60% of whites over 45. A majority of his votes came from whites over 45. The gap between non-college and college whites was the biggest. Trump had the best performance among blue-collar whites of any candidate since Reagan again. Underperformed with college whites. They kind of split about evenly in this election. And if you look at economic structure as well, you know, you see a big divide between these information age, low carbon, post-industrial metros and the parts of the country that are still engaged primarily in resource extraction, manufacturing, and ag. Exposure to immigrants. Clinton won 16 of the 20 states where immigrants are the highest share of the population. Trump won 26 of the 30 where they're the least. Energy production. All of these things now line up. Essentially, like I said, all the cherries on the slot machine line up. And so essentially, you have a Democratic Party now that is geographically based in the largest cities, that is diverse, increasingly white collar, secular. Just note, white Christians are now one third of Democrats are white Christians, okay? 75% of Republicans are white Christians. Self-identified Republicans are white Christians. And the last time that was true for the whole country was 1984. So, so you have a Democratic coalition that's based in the largest cities, that's diverse, increasingly white collar, younger, secular, by and large okay with being part of the global economy, and increasingly represented in the kind of information economy. Hillary Clinton's counties, 1/6 of the country, they account for 2/3 of the total GDP. 2/3 of the total GDP was generated in the counties that Clinton won. You have a Republican coalition that is dominant outside of the major metro areas, still 90% white, older, more blue collar, 75% are white Christians, and again, has a heavier concentration in some of those traditional industries and places, you know, and those are exactly the industries that Trump wants to promote. I look at all this, and I think all of it, by the way, fissures more in this election in that Democrats are likely to do, and John can talk about this, I'm sure, very well in the last, what I call the red pockets. The Republicans are still holding seats in the big blue metros, in the suburbs of Philadelphia and Orange County and Northern Virginia, where a poll came out today with Barbara Comstock. That race is over. It's done. And they will lose a lot of their remaining strength in metro America, white-collar suburbs especially, but probably not lose very much at all in kind of non-metro America, maybe a little bit here and there, but not a big, and so the trench between them will get even bigger. And I think when you add all of this up, you know, I've called this, I believe the fundamental dividing line in American politics is between the groups and portions of the country that are basically optimistic about the way the country is changing demographically, culturally, and economically, and those who view the way that changes as a threat. I call it the coalition of transformation and the coalition of restoration. I believe that we have been heading in a direction of a divorce between these two parts of America. Trump accelerates it because, unlike other presidents who may have accepted division between these two parts of America as a consequence of what they're doing, he affirmatively he believes it's in his interest to create more conflict between them. And I just don't know where it goes. I really don't know where it goes, in the sense that I do believe this is the 1850s, and not rhetorically, I don't know what the 1860s look like. But I know that we're heading in that direction.
And I suppose, just to strengthen your point a little more, one might have thought after the election that it would have been possible, I suppose, to have a little bit, that's what election campaigns, they heighten differences, they heighten tensions, but the rubber band relaxes a little bit as the president governs. He reaches out a little. There's some, maybe it's fake, but still some bipartisanship, and you kind of get a little bit less fraught a situation. But I suppose that's not been the last 18 months, right?
One thing that makes Trump unusual is, like I said, I mean, I think Red America felt that, felt neglected by Obama. Blue America felt neglected by Bush. Trump eliminated the state and local tax deduction. He is going to, which was an offensive act against blue cities and states. He wants to cut off, every Senate Republican and all but 7 House Republicans voted to severely punish blue cities that don't fully cooperate with ICE on immigration. They're about to try to repeal California's right to set its own standards under the Clean Air Act, which was signed, created 45 years ago. I mean, under Nixon and Ford. So it's not only kind of benign neglect from the point of view of Blue America. It's kind of like active, offensive sallies. And so, look, and I've got to think that people in Red America probably felt the same way about the contraception mandate under the ACA. So and by the way, worth noting this week, there are no non-combatants anymore. I mean, when you get this month's succession of 5-4 Supreme Court decisions, 5 Republican justices, appointed justices outvoting 4 Democratic appointed justices on the Muslim travel ban, Texas redistricting, the pregnancy stuff in California, the Ohio voter purge, everything is now, as in the 1850s, I think, being refracted through the red-blue prism. And I just don't know how long the rubber band doesn't snap.
John?
I'm not quite that pessimistic.
Yeah.
I hope we're not heading to a civil war. I think you're exactly right that we are increasingly divided over party lines, class lines, geographic lines. But to me, it seems like pretty much normal politics. I mean, if I have to say what happens in 10 years from now, we are more divided. We are shooting tweets at each other and Facebook posts and hopefully not actual bullets. But in terms of how the country has actually changed by Trump and Trumpism, how much has Trump actually transformed the Republican Party? It depends on what you exactly mean by Trumpism. If you mean Donald Trump, party loyalty, tribal loyalty, well, the Republican Party is very Trumpist. 87% of Republicans back Donald Trump. If you mean it more of an ideological way or a temperamental way, looking at the primaries of last year, it's actually less Trumpist than I would have thought. There was a key moment, I think, in Alabama where you actually had a truly illiberal person was a Republican nominee. This is Roy Moore, who, before all the sexual impropriety, all those allegations came out, he had advocated that a Muslim American duly elected to Congress should not be seated because he is a Muslim. That is about as illiberal as you can get. His defeat, I think, was a very helpful learning experience, an educational experience for the Republican Party, where over the past several months you've had these Trumpist candidates, temperamentally or ideologically speaking, they've been on the decline. The Trumpist candidate in West Virginia lost. In Arizona, Kelly Ward looked like she was going to beat Jeff Flake. Jeff Flake left the race. You now have a more establishmentarian Republican, Martha McSally, in the race, and she's up by double digits right now. If you look across the country, most of these states, Missouri, Josh Hawley, mainstream conservative; North Dakota, mainstream Republican congressman; Tennessee, mainstream Republican congressman. The one exception would be Virginia, where Corey Stewart just narrowly won last week. He has much more of an anti-immigrant, bombastic rhetoric. He indulged in conspiracy theories, birtherism, the kind of stuff that I would call temperamental Trumpism, ideological Trumpism. He won by 2 points in a race that nobody really cared about, that there was no advertising in it. So I mean, 6 months ago, I think a lot of people would have said, Steve Bannon was threatening to primary every single Republican, every mainstream Republican, every incumbent Republican with these Trumpified, ideological, temperamental Trumpists, and they've lost almost everywhere, or they're on the decline so far. There's Mississippi. It's a little more complicated there. The guy's a little wacky, anti-establishment type. I don't know exactly how I'd classify him, but it's not quite where I would have expected. You got to think the fact that Steve Bannon is gone, and why was that? It wasn't over any ideological reason. It was because he crossed President Trump. He said that it was a bad idea for his son to meet with shady Russians in Trump Tower. So Steve Bannon was defenestrated over a tribal issue, a partisan issue. It had nothing to do with ideology. And now 10 years from now, where does this go? I don't know. The party is going to lose more and more educated Republicans, moderate Republicans, and who is left in the party are people who are much more amenable to these ideological Trumpists, temperamental Trumpists. So I don't know where we're going to be in 10 years from now, but as of now, I would say we're not as bad.
Can I just add 2 things on that? Because I basically agree, except the one thing I would add is that the mainstream candidates have survived in part by conceding a lot of ground to the Trump vision particularly on the racially charged issues. On immigration, the skepticism about the wall that was there during the 2016 primary has been completely, every one of the candidates, every one of the mainstream candidates who won the primaries embraced the wall as kind of the symbol that they were. And I don't know if any of them at all, you might know better than I, if any of them supported legal status for DACA. But I know they all supported the wall.
We'll just take a step back. I mean, this is the way that Trump sort of distorts everything. I mean, the wall was a mainstream position 10 years ago. Hillary Clinton voted for the Secure Fence Act. George W. Bush signed it. I mean, the wall, every single Republican supported the wall. Trump's way, he made it his issue by saying, hey, Mexico is going to pay for it. I mean, this was not, Charles Krauthammer wrote a piece in 2006 called First a Wall, Then Amnesty. The idea of a barrier or a wall itself isn't, I mean, there are obviously racially charged issues where Trump has, I mean, he's stoked political violence. He has promoted bigotry. He is, after Charlottesville, he's indulged white nationalists. I mean, these are the real illiberal parts of Trumpism. I don't think the idea whether there should be, I don't know, I think a wall is fine. I think that if you have a barrier down there, it doesn't stop all illegal immigration. It reassures some people. It stops a particular, diminishes
the
a particular
06 and 07 version of the wall, I don't think was this wall. But to what he's talking about, to your larger point, though, so, if you look at Republican primary electorates now on the national basis, on the presidential level, it's almost exactly 50-50 college, non-college at this point, in the last couple. And this was, I think, Trump was the first time that the college and non-college wing split, but the non-college wing won. Okay, so you can certainly look at 2008, and it was very clear that McCain was the nominee of the college wing. The choice of the college wing, and I guess Huckabee at that point was the favorite of the non-college wing, which is heavily evangelical in a Republican primary. McCain won, right? 2012, Romney, Santorum, same kind of divide. Both, and I'm doing this off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure I have this right. I remember it. If you look at the cumulative exit polls in both 8 and 12, McCain and Romney both won half of college Republicans and 1/3 of non-college Republicans. Okay, that was their winning coalition during the primary. That's how they won the primary against alternatives who were rooted in the blue-collar wing of the party. Trump is the first time that the two wings have diverged. They didn't really diverge in 2000. They didn't really diverge in 80. The first time the two wings have diverged and the blue-collar wings won. Trump won half of blue-collar Republicans, cumulatively, only 1/3 of college Republicans. Okay, that's all he won, even in the primaries. I mean, if any of you who lived here looked at Northern Virginia, how poorly he did. Why is Barbara Comstock doomed? You could go back to like March of 2016, and it would tell you. I mean, he did so poorly. So, to your point that if there is an effect, if there is a contracting effect of Trump, it is felt totally, I think, almost entirely in white-collar white suburbs and among white-collar white middle manager Republicans in Oakland County, and that tilts the balance in the party further in the blue-collar, non-urban direction. As I said, the House Republican caucus, whether they have 217 seats or 219 seats, is going to be more exurban, rural, small town, and less. There will be fewer people from affluent, upper middle class, diverse, info-age suburbs. That voice in the party is going to get lower. And once this is sort of what happened to Democrats in the South. I mean, once these things happen, they have a reinforcing quality to them, self-reinforcing quality.
I mean, I guess the counter argument would be if Mitch McConnell were here and speaking candidly, which he would not be, so let's just stipulate that in public. And what if he even speaks candidly, like when he's alone with his wife? I say this admiringly, not critically, of course. He would say, we're putting up with it. You're misinterpreting our acquiescence to him as his victory. We're going to put up with this nonsense. We have to put up for 2.5 more years. At the end of the day, it goes away. We get back, not quite to where we were. That would be unrealistic. But we get back to a place closer to where we were. And that that's, I think, one of the big questions, right? Is the establishment acquiescence to Trump, clever acceptance of short, medium-term inevitability, given that, after all, he is the president, and, people aren't really used to having parties rebel against presidents in the first year and a half if the economy's good and if there's no foreign policy disaster, on the one hand, or is it a real change of the vote? Are the voters changing underneath them, and they're changing gradually, and they'll look up 2.5 years from now, and they won't be the same establishment Republican they were in 2015? I guess that's one way of putting the question.
Well, to argue against my earlier points, there are ways the Republican Party can change.
It's very dialectic up here. You know, right?
The Republican Party can change not just in primaries, but in all these retirements. So, you know, Paul Ryan won his primary against this creep Paul Nealon by 70 points in 2016. This guy was very anti-Muslim, now anti-Semitic, it turns out. But Paul Ryan's gone, and so who replaces him? What does the party look like in 4 years? I mean, there's some record number of retirements. So, you know, Steve King and Matt Gaetz are going to, you know, be more towards the center of gravity in the Republican Party 2 years from now than they are right now. So, there is a transformation going on. To what extent it keeps going, I don't know. That's the big question.
I'd focus more on you focus on the supply side, basically the candidates. Great Alan Ehrenholt book, remember the United States of Ambition. You can look at the candidates as well as I focus more on the demand side. So today, just take one variable. 85% of the House Republicans are in districts where there are fewer immigrants than the national average. 80% of them are in districts that are more white than the national average. Both of those numbers are almost certainly going to go up in November. Because again, the ones who are going to lose are the ones in diverse info-age inner suburbs, or not all the ones who lose, but disproportionately. 42 of the 51 Republican senators are from the 30 states with the lowest percentage of immigrants. Only 9 Republican senators are from the top 20. Of those 9, Arizona and Nevada have a very decent chance of losing. Texas is going to be close, but he'll probably win. And then in 2020, you have Cory Gardner and David Perdue, who are not guaranteed re-election by any means in a presidential, even Perdue anymore. So it is, as the class, as you know, as Tom Davis, the brilliant Tom Davis, former chair of the NRCC, says, the Republican Party is evolving from the party of the country club to the party of the country, right? And as that happens, there are fewer dissenting voices, I think, to kind of throw up a yellow flag on Trumpism, particularly on and I believe immigration and changing demography is the heart of Trumpism, more than trade, more than elites. I think it is. That is well, if not the heart, it is at least the highest octane fuel in the tank. And I don't know where the counterattack comes from in the Republican Party whenever he's gone, if it is a party of Arkansas, Kentucky, North and South Dakota, but no longer a party of Orange County and the suburbs of Philly. Like who is the voice that says, wow, we're kind of getting wiped out in cosmopolitan America, we have to kind of change. I just think that these things, again, use the 1850s analogy, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, there were no Northern Democrats left to prevent the party from sliding further into a pro-South position.
Just to push back on that idea again, that immigrant, I forget which panelist said on the earlier panel that if, we have a bit of a more conservative or populist trade policy, immigration policy, that isn't necessarily a threat to small L classical liberalism here. So, I mean, if we were to pass the Tom Cotton, David Perdue bill to end chain migration and decrease the number of legal immigrants from 1 million to, I forget what, 700,000?
No, 6 or 5.
6 or 5. I mean,
cut it in half.
There is a reasonable debate to be had about that. I think it's an ideological debate.
It is a reasonable debate, but it is one with clear geographic and demographic implications. I mean, the fact that 80% of the House Republicans last week and 75% of the Senate Republicans in February voted to reduce legal immigration by the most since the 1920s is a choice. And there are still Republicans who, in the House majority, represent diverse districts. And those senators, there are 9 senators from states with like a lot of immigrants. And if the party is defining itself as committed to not only combating illegal immigration, but significantly reducing legal immigration, I think it just, not to say that it doesn't add up. It can add up if you kind of keep maxing out on your strength in blue collar, evangelical, older, rural whites and the states in which those voters are dominant. But it pushes you further in that direction, and it's just kind of hard to reverse course, I think, because as I said, the voices, if Heller and Flake are gone, and there are Democrats in those seats, and Cory Gardner voted, I mean, I still can't believe that, voted for the Grassley bill to reduce legal immigration by 40%. If those people are gone, who is there to say, well, we're going to lose something if we keep going in this direction?
The normal answer to that might be they get mugged by reality, and they do max out. they lose the control of a house or two, they lose a presidential election, and then they all look up and say, whoa.
But it's not guaranteed this strategy fails in the short term, which I think you would agree.
Well, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
How close are they to maxing out, and what does that mean?
So here's an interesting thing. I mean, I was just looking at polling in Wisconsin this last week. Obviously, one of the decisive
He's
states.
from Wisconsin.
From Wisconsin.
So, yeah, right.
There's been a huge collapse of the Republican Party in the decisive states that Trump won in Wisconsin, in I don't know, Ohio. He's underwater now. I mean, in Ohio, he won it by 8 points. Trump's down his negative approval rating by -11 or something. But in Wisconsin, one of the states that you think that this new Trumpian policy should work, trade war, it should be popular in Wisconsin of all places, right? 57% think it's a bad idea, 29% think it's a good idea. The two Senate candidates there in the Republican primary are both trying to be like Trump. They're both supported. Scott Walker, who is, if nothing else, a savvy person about the politics of his own state, has from the beginning opposed this trade war, opposed the tariffs. Walker is ahead of his potential opponents right now, and the federal candidates are losing by something like 10 points against Tammy Baldwin, a very liberal senator from Wisconsin. So the idea that, we're going to, I think just an interesting point on, what is Trumpism? I mean, that ideological question on trade, it's at least it's not panning out the way it was supposed to in these Midwestern states. The only reason we're talking about the possibility of Republicans gaining a seat or two possibly in the Senate is because there are these states up where Trump won by 36 points. That's like New York as to Democrats, or California is to Democrats.
And they share characteristics. I mean, they're preponderantly white, heavily Christian, low immigrant, low info economy. It's like we're talking about West Virginia, North Dakota, Indiana, Montana, Missouri. I mean, places that have, But to your point, Bill, so I don't think necessarily the strategy has maxed out in the near term at all. But in the long run, obviously, it's much more problematic. I mean, basically, somewhere around 2000, I think 2004, 2005, was the first time in American history that white people without a college degree were not an absolute majority of the country. That was when non-college whites went below the majority. Obviously, all through most of American history, most people were white, most people didn't have a college degree. And then somewhere around, what was it? I think 11 or 12 was the first time white Christians went below a majority of the country. So white Christians are now 42% of the country. Non-college whites are probably like 45, 44. But this is what I sometimes describe this as a treadmill effect. It seems to be pretty clear that as their overall share of the population declines, their preference for Republicans grows. And that is the risk that Democrats are facing, which is that even as the willingness to see the Republican Party as kind of the defender or the champion of, blue-collar whites or white Christians is, I think, expanding. So Democrats can get kind of stuck in this treadmill where even in the last election, the non-college white share, no matter what data source you use, and I know there's a dispute about how big they are, but in every data source, census, exit, everything, they're going down. They're still going down. But Trump got so much more of them that it kind of nets out to the same thing, right? And that is the risk for Democrats for a while. Now, eventually, millennials in this election for the first time will exceed the baby boom as a share of eligible voters. And by 2024, millennials and the post-millennials are supposed to be like 47, 48% of all eligible voters. Is that right? No, that may be a little high, but they're larger than the baby boomers. And you're looking at a guy with an approval rating under 30% among millennials overall, even though it's better among non-college white. I mean, they're not immune to the same things as everything else. Non-college white men, millennials like him. But still, the census just came out, the entire under 10, every age group under 10 is now majority non-white as of this year. And by 2020, everybody under 18 will be majority non-white. So at some point, if you're basically saying we are going to organize the party around the hopes and fears, above all, of older blue-collar evangelical and rural whites, eventually that plays out, but it can go on for a while.
And they could win over some others too, I guess. I mean,
well, you'd have to, but again,
are less demographically.
You'd have to change the direction, I think.
Or persuade people or something. Yeah, I mean, the question is sort of how much is demographics destiny in this, and it has been a fair amount, right, despite candidates. I mean, I guess President Obama intensified this. Presumably, that was a sort of accident, you might say.
I think African American turnout more than I don't think it's destiny, but again, because in the sense that the Republican performance is improving among those blue collar and white. So there's kind of an offsetting demographic change is being offset by partisan change.
I think the strongest argument that in a way that the candidates have a very limited ability to resist this is actually, ironically, Hillary Clinton in 2016, who is taken now, of course, to have been a horrible candidate. It may be true. Trump couldn't have won without her. It's probably true. Comey did her in and 10 days out. That could well be true. Why'd she set up her own server and all that? But I would say if you had predicted the fact that she did worse among white voters than President Obama, when in 2008, which is not that ancient history, she was the candidate of the white working class, to be oversimple here, against President Obama, who was the candidate of upscale, metro, et cetera, types, along with African Americans, obviously. The fact that the party had become so distant from that group of the country, part of the country, is pretty startling. It's not obvious that would have, I don't know, maybe it would have been different if Joe Biden had been the nominee, et cetera, but I guess we'll test this in 2020, right? I mean, how important is the Democratic candidate to this overall, how much could a Democratic candidate slow down or arrest or reverse some of these trends in a way that's good for the Democrats?
Well, I mean, since we're on the topic of liberalism, I think we could talk a little about the illiberal left. And part of the reason for this reaction, I think, from the reactionary chic that you talked about was in response to the 2015 Obergefell same-sex marriage decision. There was the backlash in Indiana against Mike Pence in the legislature when corporate America teamed up and told them not to pass this Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which people thought could be used as an exemption from anti-discrimination laws. And I think, there's obviously economic factors, but the culture war factor is a big deal. I think that, I forget who said it, that, the right, conservatives basically felt that they had lost the culture war, and now the left was roaming the countryside shooting survivors back in 2015.
I think that was Ross.
It was Ross out there, yeah. And so I do think that, if there can be some sort of amelioration or moderation on those sorts of issues. I think the Supreme Court may have carved out some space for the Democratic candidates, where just this week with the the same-sex marriage decision and the wedding cake case back a couple weeks ago, I think that probably helps carve out some space. If this is something decided by the courts, then Hillary Clinton or the next Democratic nominee doesn't have to go so far left on those issues. I do think it's important for just sort of the future of us, of the American polity getting along, to carve out that space where there was a lot of concern among the religious right that this wasn't going to stop at the wedding cake baker, but religious schools, not just simply getting rid of their tax exempt status, but you can go so far as taking away accreditation someday and basically saying you can't participate. We're not going to recognize your degree. You can't participate in the economic life of this country or get a job without a degree. So I do think that sort of there's been some good news in that sense in the courts this week.
I would answer your question by saying I think the nominee matters only at the margin in terms of these underlying trends in allegiance and composition of the electorate. But because we're so closely divided, margins really matter, right? And I do think Democrats face a fundamental choice in 2020, of which I would not say I can sit here and pronounce that one answer is demonstrably better than the other. And the basic choice is, do you nominate someone who is mostly targeted toward reassuring normally center-right voters who are repulsed by Trump, and that you just basically they want to find an alternative, and you have to not scare them away, and there's a long list of people who would fit in that. Or do you nominate someone who is more about turning out the new coalition and energizing and motivating them on the theory that and so that would be like a Kamala Harris or somebody like that. That's like kind of that road. Or do you nominate, essentially, a middle-aged, sort of middle-of-the-road white guy, so that a lot of middle-aged, middle-of-the-road white people who find Trump to be morally repulsive, but like some of the things he's done, will feel okay voting. And, that's a big choice. And I don't think, and I do believe both of those positions will be represented on the ticket. I'm just not sure what the order will be.
Yeah. That's good. We've discussed, it seems to me the implicit in this discussion so far is that culture has been more important than economics in driving the developments in American politics over the last decade or in your
decades.
It's of all the talk about wage stagnation, which is real, and that differential economic growth between the coasts and the interior, you think that's secondary to the...
I do.
Yeah.
I think, among white people, the single best predictor of how you vote is how often you attend church, right? It's far more important than income at this point. And obviously education is rising in that, which the two are not unrelated, but the education is rising in that as a divider among whites, and gender. Essentially all of these things work. Marital status, gender and education. So, you know, the most Republican group are non-college white men, and the most Democratic group are single college white women. I mean, it follows all the way across the panel.
With income being a little less, I think.
Income less than education.
Driving less than education. Maybe less than marital status, I think.
I think marital status and education and gender are all about the same myself. But there's probably political science in the room who can correct me on that. But I think they're all among whites pretty close. And you know, there is not so much an education gap among minority voters, Hispanics and African Americans. There is a gender gap. I mean, Trump has an audience among Hispanic and black men that is not zero. Whereas among Hispanic and black women, it's pretty close to absolute zero. Especially black women. I mean, but like there have been polls with him at 20% approval among black men. Yeah.
On immigration, which you two was slightly maybe different on, Bill Galston, who does some work with a friend of many people in this room at Brookings, has just written a book, but he looked at a bunch of elections throughout the West. His view in the last 3 years is immigration dominates. I mean, the actual voting issue in whether it's Brexit or German elections or here, that there are a lot of issues bouncing around, and you can have a fancy argument that immigration itself is a proxy for other things, you know, which may be true, but as a just practical fact, if you had to pick one issue to explain voter movement, it would be immigration, for whatever that's worth. Bigger than trade, even though empirically, trade, automation, you could argue that the actual voters who were moving to Trump, it's very hard to see how they're directly affected by immigration in some of those states, which tend to be low immigration states, right? And the parts that move to Trump more have fewer immigrants.
Yes.
They may be affected by trade. People may have really lost jobs to China.
The facility to immigration is greater in the places that are least touched by it, I think. I think that's pretty clear. Just a couple of data points. I mean, in the Republican primaries, they asked in the exit polls in 20 states what should be done with undocumented people. In 18 of the 20, only a minority of Republican voters in 18 of the 20, I'll phrase it that way, wanted to deport everybody, okay? But among that minority who wanted to deport, they supported Trump in such overwhelming numbers that they provided a majority of his votes in 18 of the 20 states. And when Pew did polling at the end of the primaries, the single best correlation of warm feeling toward Trump among Republicans was the belief that the growing number of newcomers threatens traditional American values. That kind of historic poll trend question. That was the single, and the second one was the belief that Islam is more violent than other religions. Those were the two best predictors. It wasn't trade. It was that. It was changing American identity, rooting in immigration.
How about the Democrats? It seems to be, you know, when one thinks about 2016, two pretty big things happened. One massive because Trump won which is big, really big, because he won the nomination and the presidency. Sanders getting, I think it was 43% of the vote overall in the Democratic primaries, almost as much of a he was almost as much of an outlier to his party, a critic of his party, of the party's most recent presidents, as Trump was a critic of his party's most recent presidents, and as much of an outsider and challenger. That does suggest that something systemic, that is a little 1850s-ish, that both parties are having challenges. Now, you could say they're legitimate challenges. They raised important issues that have been neglected. I'm not making a judgment here on that. It's just the fact that in the same year, I think a total of 44% of primary voters, all in, 30 million primary voters in 2016, 60 million primary voters in 2016, 30 million about in each party, which is half the general election vote. So the primary vote's bigger than people think, you know what I mean? It's not, it's 60 million people. 45% of them voted for Trump and Sanders. That's not a country that's sort of happy with the political establishments of either party, right? And so what about the Sanders voters? You studied this too, I mean, and then John. How different are they from the Clinton voters? Where do they go in the future? Or is that just a kind of, I think the conventionalism on that's a little bit, kind of just a protest vote, millennials bored by Clinton, don't read too much into it, nothing as significant as the Trump voters, but maybe that's not quite right.
Well, the big, if the big divide on the Republican side was class, education, on the Democratic side was age. That was the most consistent. And I mean, Sanders' inability to make any inroads in African American and Hispanic. He did a little bit in Hispanic here and there, but never anywhere with black voters, especially in the South. And
I think we think you have to deduce this from the ex post. The white vote split evenly between Clinton and Sanders
in fact,
in the Democratic primary. Sanders won half of white
I could probably find
Democratic
that on my
voters.
computer. But yeah, approximately, yeah. You know, and he
so
won white
her
voters.
margin was entirely
He won white voters
African
in a whole bunch
Americans
of
and
states.
Hispanics.
Yeah, he won white voters in a whole bunch of states. And he generally beat her among non-college whites, as I recall. But it was, the biggest thing was age. I mean, like, you're talking about, he won a higher share of millennials than Obama did in 2008 of young people. That's the stat that I remember. And so, that does suggest, and you get to November, and Trump doesn't do any better among millennials than Romney, but Clinton does like 6 points worse than Obama, or 7 points worse, because so many of them splinter off to the third-party candidates. And it does suggest that Democrats have a problem with this geriatric leadership in a party that is increasingly dependent on young people. I mean, it seems to be, I know Sanders is 70, but somehow he became counterculture. But like the idea that like Pelosi, Schumer, Clinton, even now, and maybe it's changed after the last week, but generally speaking, roughly, the generic ballot among people 35 and older is almost exactly even. It's like maybe 1 or 2 point pro-Democrat, but basically even. And Democrats are ahead by 30 among people under 35, especially women, where they're ahead by like 40. Millennial women, Trump is in the teens, and Democrats are often in the 60s in the generic ballot. So the question of whether a party that is so dependent on younger voters can really inspire them to come out and do all this by parading a leadership that's all remembers Pearl Harbor is questionable to me. I mean, whatever else you think about Paul Ryan, and I think in many ways he will be a tragic figure in history because of his renunciation of all his Kempian roots under Trump. But he did what Republicans did what Democrats have to do. I mean, they didn't go to somebody 5 years younger than Boehner. It was like, I think it's like 15 or 18 years younger.
Yeah, more.
And I think Democrats have to do that. I mean, I think they have to, if they win back the House, if Pelosi is the speaker, that would just be an astonishing political malpractice.
So what happens in 2018? We've raised it here. I mean, the sense of what to look for, predictions. I mean,
what to look for. I think that the Democrats have a better chance of actually taking over the Senate than most people do right now. I think most people think that they look at the polls. Trump has just had a very good couple of weeks. He got a bump out of the Korea summit, as much as some of us were appalled by the indulging of a dictator who loves his people and they love him with great fervor. A lot of people saw it on TV, and hey, there's no nuclear war, and he's trying to save this, and maybe it's like Gorbachev and Reagan, and what do I know? I don't know. I think this is probably a high water mark, and if you look at the reason I think there's a better chance is if you give more weight to the actual special elections in the various states, it's been a disaster for Republicans. If you look at the polling, if you look at the polling, you think, hey, this is still kind of a toss-up. Republicans can lose the national House vote by about 6 points and still cling to a majority. They've got so many states where Trump won by 20, 30 points that they might even be able to pick up a seat or two. If they do that, then there's no way Democrats can take over the House or the Senate. But I just, if you look at, there's special elections in Wisconsin and in all these Midwestern states where things look really bad. I think Tennessee is a real vulnerability for Republicans right now. So I don't know, that's my one thought.
I think the safest prediction is that what I call the trench gets bigger, no matter which side ends up with the majority. We're going to be very tight, but the trench gets bigger. And what I mean by that is that in the House, I think it is guaranteed that Republicans are going to lose a lot of white-collar suburbs. And I have two questions. Do they lose 24 of them? I don't know if it might get, it is possible that if all Democrats do is win white-collar suburban seats, they can win enough of them to get the majority. It is more likely that they will also have to win some blue-collar dribs and drabs, upstate New York, northeast Iowa, one seat in the Central Valley, maybe one in downstate Illinois. But whether or not Democrats get to 218, and on balance, I do think they will after the border stuff will keep Democratic intensity up. Whether or not they get there, and they might fall short. It is possible they fall short. You're going to end up with Democratic hegemony in kind of the blue metros and a very small dent in the Republican dominance of non-metro. So that gets wider. And then in the Senate, in addition to Tennessee, which is kind of the wild card here, I think it is likely Republicans lose in Arizona and Nevada, which are diverse, immigrant-intensive states. and it is entirely possible they win something out of the grab bag of white interior states that Democrats are vulnerable in, like West Virginia, not likely that one, but Indiana, Missouri, and North Dakota. I will point out that since 1992, incumbent senators from the party out of the White House have lost a total of 2 elections in midterms.
Yeah.
That's it.
The Democrats are very, very lucky to have incumbents running in their most vulnerable.
Right.
I think if those were open seats,
right, it would be
done. But
you
Pascal is a tough candidate, and Heitkamp is a tough candidate.
So maybe, if I had to bet on the Senate, I'd bet 50-50. I bet, I would bet 50-50, like split. But regardless of like which side has like the 2-seat majority in either chamber, it's going to be more clearly blue Metro America against red non-Metro America, blue diverse state versus blue red interior, and the trench is just going to look even more impermeable. That's what
so a contrarian thought, possibility might be that, just no train can go forever, whatever Herb Stein said,
Right, that's right.
And maybe you get a reaction, and so if you get, I think the House thing is interesting. I did a conversation, one of those conversations I do, which Ron and I have done, and doing another one tomorrow, but with a Democrat, and we were chatting after the conversation, and we were talking about polarization and hyperpartisanship and the usual, and I said, can you imagine, could an independent candidate run in 2020? Could you really have a Macron moment? And I'll ask you both that in a second. And could the two parties finally kind of, this thing that keeps being anticipated and sometimes hoped for, it never quite happen? And I said, well, I guess, the climate of Trump and Pelosi in total, I think I used the same phrase, trench warfare on, let's say, impeachment in 2019. 40% of America just think this is totally nuts, and could we have like some normal person, kind of be in the center, run this country in a calm way? And so I was saying that, and he interrupted me. He said, why do you say Pelosi? And I actually thought he didn't understand. So, I'm saying that, they'll control the House. And he said, no, but Pelosi probably won't be Speaker.
She won't be Speaker.
Yeah. And I said, if that's true, that's an underappreciated fact.
I don't see how she could be Speaker. If they win, too many of the people who would have won would have promised not to elect her.
And so do they announce that ahead of time, or what do you think?
So I'd say the conventional answer to you...
They sort of announced it in a role. You don't know till Election Day who won. But I've got to guess, and unless they get up to like 235 seats, which I don't anticipate, if it's a narrow margin, that there will be too many people who got elected promising not to vote for her.
No, the conventional view might be, oh, come on, once they get here, they get their arms twisted and so forth. But he agreed with you. He said, not this time. Conor Lamb has said too many times on Pittsburgh television that I will not vote for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker, and he can't do it. And so we will be in a situation, conceivably on November 7th, 2018, just to shake things up. Democrats win 221, Republicans win, what's the math, whatever, 214, and a little margin. And there's clearly not 218 votes for Pelosi.
Can I make it a little worse?
Yeah.
They just finished.
Or better. This is good,
They just finished counting the votes in California this week. There's almost no way on November 7th we're going to know who has the majority in that.
So on Thanksgiving.
It may take till Thanksgiving unless the rest of the country is a little more decisive than it looks.
That'd be
great. Democrats need 5 seats out of that, or 4 seats. It could be tied, waiting for I don't know.
Yeah, that would make 2000 look, like a...
Oh my God.
So whatever. So on Thanksgiving, everyone looks up and realizes, well, there's no obvious Speaker. Now, I suppose the most obvious thing to happen, normal thing to happen, would be the Democrats reconvene and they pick someone else to be the consensus candidate. Pelosi steps down gracefully, but you could go to a ballot, I suppose, and have both Speaker candidates fall short. Weird coalitions could form. It happens in state legislatures sometimes. You get these cross-party coalitions for leaders of, don't you, sometimes of state legislatures. And then the Senate could be 50-50, and who knows at that point whether Doug Jones and Susan Collins don't get together and say we want some changes in the rules to make it less partisan and to restore regular order. I just think people generally are underestimating the potential for chaos. Chaos is unfair because it could be good, but for things happening that we're not used to happening, because Trump is such a disruptive force, and the underlying things that Ron has mentioned are so disruptive. It seems to me that it can go disruptive in a lot of different ways. Do you think that's?
Yeah, I put no boundary on the future disruption, because I feel that at the root of it all is that much of red and blue America views the other as antagonistic and hostile to their way of life. And that at any given point, somebody has to be running the show, and the party that's out of power feels really, really aggrieved. And the alternative would be, when power is divided, for them to find a way to do some kind of compromises that have support on both sides of the divide, but neither side really feels like they can risk that. So we get stalemate punctuated by brief periods of one-party government in which you just put the pedal to the metal. The last three times we've gone into a midterm with unified control of government, to your political scientist friend point, the voters have revoked it. So 2010, 2006, and 94 are the last three midterms in which one party controlled everything. Right. Neither side has had unified control for more than 4 years since 1968. We forget that we had 2 periods of 14 consecutive years earlier. 1896 to 1910, the Republicans had everything. 1932 to 46, the Democrats had everything. Republicans had everything for the whole decade of the 20s. Democrats had everything pretty much for the 60 to 68. We're nowhere near that now. It's just I don't believe it's going to happen again in my lifetime, where you're going to have one party controlling everything for 10 years.
What about the contrarian thought? It's very closely divided. The country really is sick of the some chunk of the country is really sick of the polarization. This is a little bit misleading, the red America, but some sub-chunk of red America and of blue America would prefer one America.
Right.
Say.
Right.
It's hard to know how big that sub-chunk is. They got to vote one way or the other, so the ballot's the ballot, right? But so why doesn't Seth Moulton, the moderate Democratic congressman from Massachusetts, get together with Mike Gallagher, the moderate Republican congressman from Wisconsin? They're the same age. They've been in 1 or 2 terms, both the vets actually of Iraq, and get together and say, this is all nuts. And why don't we sponsor legislation, that addresses A, B, or C issue, and forget about our leadership and get people from both sides? Is it just the forces against that kind of, let's call it centrist entrepreneurship, are just too great, do you think? Either political or in Congress?
In the sense of just collaborating on a specific issue, or what?
So either. Could you even collaborate on a specific issue, or could that lead to something broader?
I think you can. In terms of a broader reshuffling of the parties and an independent candidate, at the end of the day, there are just these ideological issues on which the parties split very intensely. There was just a Gallup poll out last week about how, the issue of abortion is the one issue that splits the parties in two. And so how does an independent candidate in say 2020 negotiate that issue? Are there moderate Democrats who would tolerate a John Kasich if he gave certain reassurances? And it's an interesting question. I don't know that I would imagine if the Democratic Party nominates someone like Bernie Sanders, that most of the party will simply fall in line at the end of the day. There is an opening there. There's a realistic opening for an independent candidate, a Kasich type, to run a Macron's type race. But I think at the end of the day, we are so polarized, as Ron thinks, that people would fall in line for Bernie Sanders just as they did for Trump on the right.
I think you're right that there's obviously a measurable chunk of red and blue America that doesn't like all of this. But I think I've been covering politics since the early 80s. I think the portion of each that views the other side as actively hostile to them has grown a lot. And there's good, interesting Pew polling on all of this, just a couple of weeks ago. And I think that it's hard. The paradox of the third party situation is that as the parties get more polarized, there are more people who don't feel fully at home in each definition of the party as it's becoming. So there's theoretically a bigger audience for the third party. The problem is, as they get more polarized, the consequences of the other side winning become more intense. So you become more reluctant to, quote, chance or risk or waste your vote. 80,000 people in Florida left their homes in November 2000. You voted for Ralph Nader and got the Iraq War, which was not what they were planning when they left that morning, right? It was not their intent, and leaving Kyoto. So I think that is just, it's this paradox, and maybe eventually the paradox breaks. And you're right, if you had Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump, there would be a lot of, in particular, white-collar white people who were like, what the hell? And you could imagine kind of that Bill Bradley, Michael Bloomberg thing. Leaving a predominantly minority coalition of Democrats and a primarily blue-collar white coalition of Republicans, and then, kind of Kasich, Bradley, Bloomberg, that kind of Tsongas, for those of you who have long memories, that kind of candidacy, fiscally responsible but socially liberal, would have an audience. It would.
Because it's not, this I guess would be the argument, it's not slavery, it's not really It's a House that thinks it's divided and is divided culturally and, I don't know, attitudinally and emotionally, and it's a real thing.
Issue. There is not. You're saying there's not a single issue.
Yeah, and it's not even clear to me how many real issues there are at the end of all the Flight 93 and all that stuff. I mean, well, certainly, first of all, once Trump's been president and once the court is more conservative, at least by one justice, maybe two. But even on the court thing, which is the default for the reluctant Trump voter, they got to do it because what is the court going to do for you? I mean, in the real world, it's not going to overturn same-sex marriage, and it's not going to overturn Roe. And if it overturned Roe, 20 state legislatures would restore a Roe regime, and that would be, fine. It would be more inconvenient. I think it was very bad jurisprudence, but people are a little overdue. So what actual, and even on the legislative issues, the Republican tax bill was a Republican-ish bill, corporate, anti-blue state. At the end of the day, it was not, the biggest change in the tax code ever. Obamacare, they failed to repeal it, big hoopla. No one's even thinking about it anymore. That turned out to be a total fake issue in the sense that I think it's important for various reasons, but, there were 20 million people on Obamacare. Most of the people in this room have the same health insurance they had before Obamacare. Their health insurance, we can make a fancy argument, has slightly gone up in cost because of Obamacare or whatever, but I mean, in effect, it's the same insurance companies with the same annoying, dealing with them in annoying ways and so forth. So I don't know, it does feel to me sometimes like it's a giant kabuki theater where everyone has talked themselves into a huge culture war. About what? I mean, it was at times there have been real choices and real differences, but it's not so clear to me in 2020, for example, that it will be that way. But I suppose if it feels that way, it is that way in some sense. I don't know. I mean,
from the social, since you, on those issues, from the social conservative perspective, I mean, there was the genuine fear that one more justice and you get not just Roe versus Wade, but you get taxpayer-funded abortion nationwide, religious liberty, the contraceptive mandate, those sorts of things. And like I said, a non-discrimination law being used to basically chase people from, we're shutting down, there already are. I mean, in Philadelphia, you're shutting down Catholic charities doing adoption work. And where does that end? Does that end by shutting down every Catholic, 10, 15, 20 years from now? I don't know. I mean, I've not been an alarmist, but I do think that there were real reasons. I think given how bad that is, I do think that in the long run, Trump is still worse for the Republican Party, the conservative movement, that they're lashed to him, and there's going to be some price to pay, and that there are going to be many. Neil Gorsuch is not the last Supreme Court nominee.
Yeah, so I don't minimize really the importance of religious liberty in the court, but I would say by itself, that's a big issue. But if it's not accompanied by a big economic difference between the party, a big size of government difference between the party, a big foreign policy difference between the parties, is it enough to sustain the kind of cultural division
that
I'm talking about?
As you were talking about, I was thinking, basically, white Christians are now a minority and feeling, in many cases, kind of aggrieved, threatened, and everything you said could have applied to Democratic, ethnic minority groups, right? I mean, the same way Hispanics and African American, they all feel the same sense of threat from Trump, who in a variety of different ways, some rhetorical, some policy, are basically saying either we don't want you here or we do not consider you full Americans. And so, like, for me, the answer to your question is, yes, it can. I think it can keep going in this. I mean, if you have a Democratic Party that is essentially the reflection of the diversifying part of America, and you have a Republican Party, 3/4 of whom are white Christians, many of whom feel, but are less than the majority of the country, so they kind of feel that they're on the back foot, as they say in England. Yeah, I can see those two coalitions scratching and clawing for many years.
I mean, I guess your point is once you get identity politics going, if that's maybe not quite fair to call it that, but
yeah, because it self-reinforces.
It self-reinforces. This is your key argument, that it self-reinforces. It doesn't self-check. The system doesn't check it.
I think it self-reinforces. I mean, the Republican Party is now entirely dependent on the portions of American society that are least touched by diversity, least touched by immigration, and least welcoming of both. And, Democratic white Christians are now 1/3 of the Democratic coalition. They're not exactly the big, a lever. 1/3 are secular and 1/3 are non-white Christians. So they're just very, and the urban-rural thing, I mean, all of these, again, all of the cherries are now economically. I mean, we have a surplus in services. Services have the most to lose, probably. You have a lot to lose with the Trump trade, but they're overwhelmingly centered in cities. And that's what people in cities do. I mean, there's some other stuff, but you look at the industries that Trump wants to promote: more energy production, manufacturing. They're, and I can't remember the stats, but I've written on this. They're disproportionately in rural places, and they're white, gun-owning Christian rural places. I mean, it all lines up now with partisanship in a way that is not true through most of American history.
Final question, since Adam was anxious here. So final, I'll make a James Fallows, David Brooks kind of point here. Kind of a can't we all get along point, Now I forgot the points. I'm so averse to usually making these points. I can't.
Well, we could ask you. You've avoided. Usually we're like, do you see this? Do you see a circuit breaker?
Only in that I sort of am contrarian enough to think that often
the Herb Stein.
Yeah, and that either a third party or an internal challenge in the Republicans and or the Democrats, or something that wakes people up to the sort of dangers of just going down the course where I'm not sure what. But I mean, we haven't really seen a real world in the Republican and Trump case. I think the Trumpification of the Republican Party looks, in my opinion, stronger than it might really be because the economy is good and there's no foreign policy disaster. And parties just don't break from their president without one of those things happening. And they don't break simply on the, we don't like his tweets and he has bad character and he shouldn't have said this, and even that this is dangerous down the road. Now, trade, in a way, you've seen a little thing there. In the immigration thing, you've seen some of the real consequences, I would say, of a certain rhetoric on immigration. Otherwise, it's all just talk. The wall, is a perfect thing for Trump and nothing changes. But, if you're really separating families, I mean, what do people think of that? We'll see if there's a trade war or not. We'll see what Mueller's report is. So I can sort of see things looking very different. Maybe this is wishful thinking, however, 6 or 9 or 12 months from now on the Republican side. Democratic side, I would say, sort of John's point. I mean, most of my Republican friends cheer themselves up, in effect, by saying, well, it's just as bad on the Democratic side. They're gone crazy, too. They're all like Maxine Waters. But I don't know. Ralph Northam isn't like Maxine Waters.
People getting elected so far.
And the people getting nominated so far are mixed. Now, some of them are.
They're mixed. They're mixed.
Mixed.
Yeah.
So, empirically, could you make a case that there's a future for moderate Democrats and non-Trump Republicans? Maybe. Oh, here's the question I remembered, though, which I'll let you guys close on. So for the Fallows-Brooks argument, I think might be, our politics at the national level are broken. The society, the culture is not really as split as national politics in that respect, and the proof is states and localities, which are sort of being governed adequately without much in the way of cultural civil wars in a lot of these states. Some of them have governors of the other party than you would expect, some of them being reasonably popular and doing pretty well. It doesn't feel, when you go to the state capitals or to the mid-sized cities or whatever, that we're in some. It doesn't feel like this, like the Civil War, which really did divide everything down to religious, down to churches and down to states, and so forth. I mean, what's the answer to that? I think is that a correct representation of Fallows? Yeah, and a little David. Yeah.
So cities are not divided because they're separated.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no. It's like like the Republican resistance in Chicago. I did an event the other day with the openly gay woman DA of Houston, who has decriminalized marijuana, and all the heat she's getting is from the left.
Yeah.
Because she's not doing enough in Houston. Okay, so the city thing is kind of a different category. And I guess I would dispute. I think the states are tilting more red and more blue. I mean, the red and blue states are moving further. I wrote about this, in the 90s, John Engler and Tommy Thompson were not suing Bill Clinton every 4 hours.
Right. Okay.
But starting under Obama with the red states and now continuing totally under Trump with the blue states, they have to. I mean, they have to fight. It's a horizontal war and a vertical. It's like both if you're president. Now you're fighting. And the policy, I remember after Newtown, California and Connecticut instantly passed gun control, and South Dakota and Tennessee, I think, were voting on arming teachers.
Yeah.
So I think, in fact, that, yes, at the municipal level, there is, it's sort of all consolidated. It's all consolidated on one side. But I think at the state level, they're moving further apart.
Last word to our millennial.
Politics could be pretty nasty. Prior to Trump at the state level in Wisconsin, I mean, Scott Walker was getting interrupted at speeches to the Special Olympics. I'm not making that up. So things were pretty nasty. I mean, I think in terms of the animosity, the incivility that we see so much, I think that there's obviously a huge technological component to that, 10 years ago, we weren't poking each other in the eye every 5 minutes on Twitter and Facebook. You know, you can only poke someone in the eye once a week or, you know, once a day on TV. So I don't know how much that overinflates our sense that there's a civil breakdown, or it actually causes that to happen.
John, Ron, thanks very much for an interesting discussion.
Good job.